Joining us, in addition to our previous speakers, and Amy Friedlander had to fly out this morning, we have two of our very distinguished faculty members from Case Western. We have Cyrus Taylor, who's the Dean of Arts and Sciences, sitting over here. And sitting at the far end is Lev Gonick, who's the Chief Information Officer at Case. And as I said before we broke, I really would like this to be a very interactive discussion. So at any time, please feel free to raise the hand, but since we are taping this, I would ask that you raise your hand so that I can walk around like Phil Donahue used to walk around and hand you the microphone.
You're dating yourself.
I know. Is the caller there? So what I wanted to try and do is kind of touch upon digital scholarship in the various stages that it goes through, from research to creation and management of information to dissemination of information, and ultimately the reward and recognition that comes from professional accomplishment. And how do we integrate these processes, and how do different players play a part in that process, and where are the similarities and differences between digital scholarship and traditional scholarship, and are the lines already blurred? So to get the discussion started, I want to ask this question on the research side. One way in which digital scholarship can be different is the use of digital technology and how it's used in collaboration and to foster collaboration. Amy yesterday, for example, spoke about the trending that's occurring towards large collaborative research. And I wanted to ask the panel, and perhaps Cyrus, you can start with this. How do you think collaborative models will be changing in scholarship in general, and what successful models have there been in the past that we might build upon?
Well, thank you, Arnold, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and actually, I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend more of the conference. I think probably part of the reason you're directing the question to me is that Amy specifically mentioned, I think, models from high energy physics in CERN. And as a high energy physicist, you know, I've sort of lived through this evolution. There are a huge number of issues, and I'll try and just briefly touch on them at the moment, and we might explore some of them later. And I think I'd lay them out in sort of maybe quasi-historically and offer them up as models for what happened within high-energy physics and what might, therefore, by analogy, happen in other disciplines. First issue, of course, was high-energy experiments 50 years ago. Took lots of photographs and so on, and people looked at individual events. But the breakthrough was when digital ways of collecting data came into being, so that you were able to amass much, much larger data sets automatically, and thereby move the analysis from something that involved a fair amount of subjective judgment on the part of individual scanners of photographs to you know, straightforward fitting and manipulation of the data. Second thing, and so there's a whole variety of issues there, and I think any field, as there become, for example, in literature, digital corpuses of that one can work with, or biology, where one has automated ways of collecting large volumes of data, one can expect that just the way in which the field operates will change. There'll be new tools that come in that would allow you to ask new questions that you couldn't do before, and it will change the essence of what it means to be functioning in that field. Second thing is in terms of collaboration. And again, I like to remind people, far too few people know it, that as this happened, the size of the collaborations in high-energy physics grew. At the Large Hadron Collider at the moment, the two large experiments, Atlas and CMS, have author lists of about 3,000 PhDs each. So it's quite, yeah. So the collaborations are large, and managing the collaboration is complicated. So in the very early 1990s, CERN sponsored a project to develop new tools for high-energy experimentalists to collaborate that. We call this the World Wide Web. The web was developed for high-energy experimentalists to collaborate, and then they gave it to the rest of the world for free. and it's changed the rest of our lives. Third thing that you alluded to were issues of sort of authorship credit and cultural norms within the field. When you have collaborations of 3,000, or even, I'm a member of the smallest of the collaborations at the Large Hadron Collider, it's Totem. It's about 95 people. It means that you have to think about what it means to be an author, what it means to take responsibility in a different way than when the norm is an individual investigator doing all the work themselves. This shows up, for example, in just, how do you list 3,000 authors on a paper. And so the rule is it starts alphabetically by country, then alphabetically by the city the institution is in, then within the institution alphabetically by last name, and then alphabetically by first name. So that by looking at the order of the author list, there's no way you can, there's no indication of any preference. And this isn't new. We had a small experiment here that was led from here back in the 90s called Minimax. It's a collaboration of about a half dozen institutions and followed the same sort of rules with the upshot that the papers all appeared as T. Brooks et al., where Travis Brooks was a freshman when the whole thing started. So in any case, this has meant that the fields have had to deal with, how do you evaluate an individual's contribution in the context of the large enterprise and the promotion and tenure process, any of a variety of other things. And what I would argue is that it's been quite successful. There's maybe one other tidbit I'd throw out, and that is at a very early stage, in the late 80s, in particularly theoretical particle physics, but particle physics more generally, and to some extent other parts of physics, was the norm when you wrote a paper and sent it to a journal, you would also send it to all the research institutes in the world. And beginning about 1987, that was automated, which meant that everyone in the world had access to what people were thinking as soon as they sent it out, not when it was published, but as soon as it was sent out, which has meant that the field has become much more dynamic, much more interactive, and moved much, much faster than was the case before, or than is the case, I think, in disciplines where you don't actually widely share the results of your work until it appears in some print publication. So, I don't know, there's a lot packed in there.
Thank you. Other people want to respond to the question? Laura?
Well, I have written down a couple things, but I wanted to point out again that I work in a field, English literature, which is highly focused on the individual author, and there needs to be in that field a sea change, a cultural change, which is precisely what we're talking about here. And anytime you say to faculty, we need to be more like the sciences, they want to shoot you. So I don't say that. But one thing that I think we can do, because collaboration has opened up whole worlds for me personally, is, and these are just very practical things, fund faculty projects at a very small rate, $5,000 each, and don't let the faculty member drop their work off at the door. In other words, part of what one might do is include as the strings attached to that fellowship that you have to collaborate with the digital workers or computer scientists or whoever. I think CUNY Commons, CUNY, the whole CUNY system, has this amazing thing called CUNY Commons where people who want to collaborate are listed. I'm trying to get a version of that, but they've released it open access. So to, I think a lot of people would love to collaborate but have no idea whom to collaborate with. And then finally, I'm remembering William Blake's adage, what now exists was once only imagined. And I think that imagining is key here. The question that I didn't get to ask Nin this morning, which I would have loved to have asked, is, here's this beautiful work of scholarship. When I write a book, I imagine it as a book. I imagine the table of contents, I imagine the index, I imagine each chapter. What would it be like to imagine something else before you even begin the scholarship, before you even start writing? And so what happens when you do that? If you can get people to start thinking in those terms, lots can really change, I think, quickly. So.
Well, I'd simply sort of pose by way of a challenge that one of the enablers of the storyline that Cyrus shared, and he called it out, is the network effect. And it's impacted all of our lives. And the challenge is, what are the analog, the equivalents for big humanities that can take advantage of the network effect? What are the engagement strategies? As Laura just said, a lot of our social science and humanities, but in particular the humanities community, oftentimes have a profoundly big canvas upon which they typically ask very deep, very focused kinds of questions. And the network effect affords us a chance to go to the big canvas. And there have been a number, obviously, that have been discussed, but a number of these kinds of projects, and it strikes me that those are the ones that we should be looking for to provide for the disruption that will lead to a 30 or 40 year story like Cyrus shared in the world of physics. Absent that, the idea that we can grow from the current strategy, which is effectively incremental, towards something transformational is not likely to happen. That's not what the network effect is about. The network effect actually enables, if we can imagine a big humanities set of questions that then calls for massive collaboration on questions that are at the scale of the big canvas as opposed to the smallest pieces of paint that we want to put on the canvas.
I'm going to switch a little bit, but stay within collaboration, but in a different way, which is partnerships in the research process. And Nenny's project certainly is a good example of this, of working with people from a university press, working with people at Columbia in their digital services. But last night, a faculty member from CASE remarked to me about that it's interesting to see the different perspectives when Steve was talking about this process from the perspective of a librarian versus the perspective of a researcher. And how do we bring these communities, how do we bring the IT community, the library community, other communities that can be partners in this process? What do we need to do? How do we need to work better? How do we need to partner and marshal the resources? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, one simple start, I think, is to just assign, if you're involved in the creation process, to assign, to consider the question of whether you want to assign an open license to the data. So one, the data and the data policies, they become proxies for the human beings in these big collaborations. So with a certain type of Creative Commons license and electing to put information on a server that's broadly open, we're basically expressing an intention to have our information shared in its most broad construct without any real control over the circumstances of that, and electing to see that as a good outcome. At the same time, of course, you could partner with your given publication group to have a specific rendering or organization of your information. So I'd say, in addition to those messier and more time-consuming kinds of human-to-human collaborations and reaching out to people through all the various communication networks we have, simply thinking a little bit more about the data we make, where we elect to store it, and whether we explicitly associate an open license with it will have different consequences and ramifications regarding where it can go, how it can be reused, repurposed, remixed.
Go ahead.
I think it is really important that, I'm speaking as an author, I think it's really important that the material that becomes digital is accessible by everyone, right? So I know that there are electronic books out there which have a number of their pages redacted, right? And I think that might be an issue for publishers because they don't see sales go up. It might be a problem for authors who want to say that their books have sold so many copies. But it is not collaborative, and it is not collegial, and it is ultimately it is anti-pedagogical. So I think that the first thing that we need to do is that as authors we need to disentangle ourselves from the number of copies that our books sell as indicators of our worth or tenure, whatever. And I think that this such an undertaking cannot be and should not be anything other than a democratic engagement with scholarship.
Can I offer sort of a slightly counterpoint to that? And that is sort of the concept of translational scholarship, which is to say that in the near term and in fact in the midterm, there's very likely to be almost no way other than to posit that we should have nothing but a kind of a collaborative arrangement to change the rules overnight. Not that isn't a desirable end point, but rather to acknowledge and to support the production and preparation of scholarly submissions seems to me to be entirely appropriate. What we need to now take advantage of, again, this is obviously the technologist speaking on the panel, is to take advantage of the network effect and the community of around our universities to help in the translation of that scholarly piece of prepared material into multiple other forms without actually having the author necessarily have to become engaged in the creation of a multimedia piece on her or himself, or a piece that would perhaps be used in a magazine format, or a piece that might be used in a television broadcast format. To answer the question, Arnold, I think that the support units of the university community are extraordinarily well positioned to contribute to the translational part of scholarship by taking the given and affording an opportunity to transform and transpose that scholarship into using multiple media to afford access in as open and public a way as we want to, and as many different approaches: multimedia, broadcast media, interpretive media, and those are the things that librarians and library resource specialists. That's the thing that technologists can do to create pictures and stories associated with those pictures that might not be the way that a scholar gets credit for what they do, but that is what makes it open and available.
Laura?
I would like to speak against that a little bit. So just get things livened up here a little. I mean, at a deep level, I think you're right. But I want to say that there's a real danger in cordoning off what technologists do from the scholarship. And the biggest danger that I have seen is that every bit of technology that I've viewed that has been produced in the absence of expert advice about the historical materials that it's running, because I'm a literary historian, it's mostly historical materials, looks very stupid. You know, and it looks stupid because experts can tell you things about what's wrong with the data set. They can tell you how the data set needs to be massaged in ways that the technologist will never know because they didn't study that, right? They didn't study this data in the way that the experts did. And, you know, I think that we need to force this kind of collaboration between technologists and scholars sooner rather than later as a way of making sure that the value of digitization comes to the fore.
I vehemently agree.
You're supposed to.
Yeah, I strongly agree with everything except your use of the verb force, because
Spoken like a dean.
Yeah. I actually think this goes back to one of your earlier points about English and the existing modes of scholarship. I think we need to foster an environment in which those collaborations take place, but we shouldn't try to force people to do it. This is a process of change of the disciplines that will probably take quite a while. However, the basic point you make, I think, has, namely that it involves collaboration in terms of the tools that are used for the collection of the data, for the analysis of the data, and so on, raises a point relative to the other points that were made in terms of role of archiving it. The data is not abstract. It's not just a set of zeros and ones. There's an environment in which it was collected. There's presumably a whole set of tools that one needs to be able to understand, not just at the time, but in the future, if one's really going to be able to evaluate the database. Any analysis that's done of it involves a set of tools that were developed. And one of the fundamental challenges is that as computer technology, network technology, and so on continues to evolve, those tools are not likely to run on any machine 5 years from now. So that you're faced with a task of not just archiving some abstract data, but archiving the entire analysis and collection environment as well, and capturing all the wisdom that went into it. Because, sadly, one of the lessons, again, of high-energy physics is if that isn't done with great intentionality, in a decade's time, there won't be any way you have the data tapes sitting on the shelf, but there's no way to read them, and nothing you can do with them. So I think this makes it very interesting. The final point I'd make is in the context of the kind of collaboration that Lev was talking about in terms of network effects, this transcends the university. So while the university will have a role in supporting and fostering it for really large-scale projects of the sort that Lev was talking about, the university can only be a piece of sort of a larger initiative to make sure that that this is really preserved. And your references to things like Google Books and so on is a good example of what happens when that's not necessarily well integrated with the larger community.
Yes, Peter.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. Sorry. So much for technology, right? I agree with what's been said, but from the point of view of an individual, researcher and writer and scholar, I'm more and more finding that, let's say when I deal with the librarians, which I've worked with closely, there's a whole different vocabulary and jargon going on that I'm not that terribly fluent in. So it takes me a long time just to communicate my needs to the library and for them to communicate back to me what I need to know. I'm sure that same kind of gap exists between the library on the one hand and IT people on the other hand. And I'm getting a sense that this kind of collaboration between IT, libraries, and scholars is going to take so much time to come up with a common vocabulary, to get each to understand the others, and all of that takes away time from getting the actual work done. And I'm kind of feeling lost in that there's too much going on and too many different domains being created. I'm not sure how to overcome that.
So Peter, I think this gets back to the opening part of my last comment. I'm not necessarily you should view it as your responsibility as such to overcome it, although you need to try and help navigate it. The deeper issue you raise that the task of navigating between these various domains is going to be extremely important if this larger sort of vision comes to pass. I think suggests that that the people that actually do that, that is going to effectively be their scholarship, and we have to find ways of recognizing that and building on it. And again, by analogy with what happened in high-energy physics, that's what I expect to happen here, and it's not going to happen overnight. No.
I'd like to disagree.
No.
Just to be the contentious person here.
She's trying real hard to be, but
Yeah, but you're so nice.
Agreeing.
I know. I do think it's our responsibility to learn other vocabularies. I think it's the only way that genuinely interdisciplinary work will be done. And one focus of the 9 Summer Institute, which is about promoting and tenuring people who have created digital archives, is to develop precisely a vocabulary. The vocabulary includes understanding. it's not just semantics, it's not just words. It includes understanding when someone, for instance, has created a digital resource that will be runnable no matter how the technology has changed. So, for instance, Nin, one reason they didn't want to give you those little pop-up notes, I'm retrofitting a resource that has them, and the JavaScript no longer works. So anybody who came to an article that was produced in this environment would say, why didn't this author put any notes in there? You know, they have no support for their argument. Or so, you know, this is the kind of thing precisely that humanists need to know. It's part of imagining what to write. It's part of all of that. I don't think it's easy, and I do think it involves retooling.
If I could just respond briefly, given the vigor of the disagreement. So you started off with a premise that this is the only way that interdisciplinary work can occur, and I actually more or less agree with everything you say and would suggest it's consistent. However, what I disagree with is that we should expect everyone to be doing interdisciplinary work. As this evolves, you know, I expect at the present time most people are going to continue doing work in their disciplines and asking the narrow questions. Not everyone is suddenly going to become an interdisciplinary thinker about the universal level issues that Lev raises, and we should respect that.
It's a noble goal.
No, I'll jump in and I'll agree from a practitioner's perspective. One of the things I like, trends that I'm seeing in my own university that I think are appearing in other places is the appearance now of institutes, offices, labs that are appearing on campus, and through a self-selection process. I still have my full-time day job as a librarian, but if I go to the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, I have an opportunity to meet with people through a self-selection process who are there for the pizza and an opportunity to discuss a problem that we elect to be a common problem. And then from that, somebody might propose a grant application, and we have a traditional project with a linear process of goals. But these venues of institutes and permitting ways of actually creating venues on campus for people to come together in a part-time fashion to elect to work around certain problem solving, I think is creating some real opportunities for innovation, and innovation in one of the more difficult areas of communication and translations. And I think that these kinds of places are good, and I think they're effective because there's permission from our deans and higher administrators for experimentation and failure, and they're also smaller groups of people. So I think we have an opportunity to promote some engagements, and I hope that these things exist for a while and don't become too narrowly structured and swallowed up by traditional academic structures of departments and,
Can I just answer
things.
this?
Yeah.
So I just want to answer really quickly, because I know other people have great things to say. I actually do think that you're forcing me to think about the difference between interdisciplinarity and just sheer literacy. But I do think sheer literacy involves a great deal more interdisciplinarity than I don't think the humanities disciplines, at least, can continue with such a narrow focus and survive.
Just one. I actually agree with you about the disciplines, but that's not the same thing as saying that individual practitioners have to change.
Disciplines don't
Yeah.
change unless
Yeah.
the practitioners
Not,
change.
but not
because
everyone has to at the present
we
time.
won't make them.
So I just want to play the devil's advocate here, and Lev, I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind. So it seems it's interesting that there's a paradigm now which everybody is upholding as being the dominant one, and it perhaps is hegemonic. And Lev, you used this interesting language of translation, and then you suggested kind of subtly, which was recognized by a few people on the panel, that you would translate it and translate this author's work, this academic's work, and you would give your own interpretation, and you would do this. And it seems to me that there's a peculiar thing going on here, is that it seems that I'm just going to use devil's advocate language here, is that as a peculiar kind of technocrat, you are going to steal our information or use our information and market it on your own, even though you have absolutely no academic background to do that with my particular kinds of work. And because of the particular paradigm that's now regarded as dominant and is certainly hegemonic, is that I'm supposed to learn your language when this occurs, but God forbid you learn my language. And anyway, you're going to translate it to your language and sell it as if it was my scholarship, but really it's your scholarship. And somehow this is a good thing. And this makes me worry tremendously, and actually makes me want to become a Luddite in a peculiar sort of way, and race away and just translate Sanskrit and hide under someplace. So
That's what you really think.
Right. I think that Apple stock, people should buy Apple stock.
When it was $20 a share, not when it's $416 a share. Today, 403. All right. It's down a little bit. Yeah. So the notion of translational engagement, translational scholarship, is not about appropriation of the scholar. It is actually starting from the output that scholars are incented and rewarded for producing in the academy. And it really is the foundation of collaboration between service organizations with scholarship for making that scholarship accessible to other scholars. So just to pick up on the last point that's being made here, some of the most difficult translations are actually between, for example, humanities and scientists, humanities and engineers. There is a language barriers. Every bit as complicated as between the technologists and the librarians and the scholars. So in fact, translational support actually affords a chance to use other media for taking and working together with scholars so that they can find common language. And it's also about actually public dissemination of scholarly output, which is another very important part of all scholarship and certainly the institution. And the overall challenge of, again, leveraging or certainly not turning a blind eye to the network effect, which is to say we have no choice but to seek public support for our scholarship going forward, and therefore making it accessible. How does one make it accessible? Well, there are opportunities to obviously present public lectures about your scholarship. There are opportunities for other community-like engagements, and another form of it is actually sitting down with scholars and librarians and technologists and creating product that is entirely consistent and bears, in fact, only the name of the scholar, enabled and supported by the service organizations in the university in a way that is publicly accessible, should, in fact, the actual initial incentive and motivation be one that is perhaps less accessible to the public. So that is not a devil's advocate response. That's actually the authentic meaning of translational scholarship, at least in the way that I intended it to be.
Nenny?
Can I ask you something just so that I understand? Why do you say that technologists, people who, IT people, or whichever way I should call it,
Them. We call them them.
on the other side of the table, table, who want to take my book, my paper, and then add to it photographs and videos and stuff, and then put it up there.
Because that's science too, but perhaps for a different kind of science. That's humanities too, but for a different kind of humanities.
No, my question is different.
Okay.
Why would them do this outside of me? That's my question.
And Nenny, can I ask, before we have the response, can I ask you this question? Because I wanted to ask this question before. It seems to me that what Lev was describing is exactly what you did in your process. And maybe I misunderstand your process.
That's what I think.
But that you said, I have a vision of what I'm trying to communicate as scholarship, but I do not have either the database management skill or the presentation skill or the graphic design skill or any of those skills, and that's where the partnership, it seemed to me, was coming in. Did I misunderstand?
No, that's exactly it. And
I vehemently agree with you as well.
but the
There is
question.
no them in this scenario. I mean, them is really just an artifact of perhaps an earlier instantiation of what IT was about, and perhaps it's still about on some campuses.
No, but you said I really want to understand this. This is not a confrontational question at all. I really want to understand this. Why did you say that you would take this and do it without the input from the...
I've used the word partnership, collaboration. I'm not sure. What other words would you like me to use?
None. I just wanted to make sure
the
that...
examples that we're using here on the campus are all about the ownership of the scholarly material, the ownership of the derivative material, all belongs to the scholar. In the end, in reality, long ago, 25 years ago, we acknowledged that there were certain things that we didn't expect scholars to have to figure out on their own. They didn't all have to create their own courses online from HTML code. They didn't all have to become database specialists. They didn't all have to, et cetera, et cetera. So there is an evolving role for librarians and technologists, I would argue, to be not co-producers. I'm not using the language of essentially of equality between the efforts, but actually of enabling this very important work to reach different kinds of audiences, whether it's within the institution, humanities community, engineering community, to other scientists, for example, or to a public. And I don't think that any of us have that complete skill set, and it's an enormously, I think, valuable additional or value add that technologists can bring to a scholar who's trying to reach across the campus or beyond the campus.
Who would be
Laura?
the agent of this translation?
The agent.
Yeah, who would make this translation possible?
Well, the scholar would agree that that was something that they aspired to do.
I want to sort of take this question another way, which is to just give you a little bit of history. In creating the Poetess Archive, I worked with a man who's head of IT services at Miami University called Dave Woods, and he has a PhD in particle physics and got that job because his wife is a faculty member there, and he could get this job, and he had worked on early programming in particle physics. When we collaborated, I ended up having to teach him about poetry, and he got the equivalent of an MA in English literature working with me on that project. So your question is absolutely apposite. I'm wondering now, in listening to this wonderful conversation, I think in resisting the distinction between scholarship and service, as I wish P&T committees to do in looking at digital materials, I also want to resist that form-content split that you're describing in thinking about a service organization. In other words, I think a service organization has to have a huge intellectual component with which I can interact. Obviously, this man with the PhD was one of them. It was very important to me for him to be saying to me all along, this happened in my field, Laura, about 10 years ago. I can tell you what we did. That intellectual work, that intellectual collaboration requires overcoming the distinction between form and content, which I think when you try to translate, precisely to get to your point, my scholarship into some digital form, you immediately see as impossible. In other words, the content itself had to be imagined as native to that form for it to be my work.
Yeah, if I may, partly in your defense, Lev, and partly to attack you, if I may, as a devil's advocate. Right. So, Lev, you gave you gave a definition of translation that had you given beforehand, I wouldn't have attacked you the way I did. Right. So you used. Right, but you clearly said something that made many of the academics here quite anxious, and you perhaps didn't recognize that because you're using the word translation in a way that's very different from the way I use it as a translator of Sanskrit and English. You use it very differently, right? But
that's actually a great example,
right,
of the challenges not between technologists,
right,
and humanities scholars, but between the medical sciences world and the humanities.
So
that word, translational medicine,
right,
which we've come to know, I did nothing except insert scholarship as opposed to medicine, and the rest follows.
Right, and then you presume that we all knew what this was, and we didn't, right? So, and that's why you attracted all this negative attention, right? So along. I'm sorry. Right. So along those lines, two things strike me. One of them is that something that we always used to say when I was an undergraduate, which is that you need to define your terms, right? So we all need to agree on what we mean by these words. And just as a kind of, I guess perhaps amusing aside, is that when I was doing my PhD, I had to pass a German and French reading exam, and it would be quite useful for me, for sure, and perhaps others, if there was some kind of seminar or class giving us this language, and then I could probably communicate with you better. And that is perhaps something that Cyrus could implement if you understand my translation. but you, I mean, if you follow what I'm saying, is that this is clearly one of the first steps, is that for me to be able to talk to you, I need to know I need some translation about what you mean by translation.
Arnold and his colleagues convening is actually part of that seminar.
That's what we're doing now.
That's what we're doing, right?
Hooray!
And if we knew it in advance, very
Could you pass the microphone over to Tim, please?
Since we're on this topic of collaboration between technology people, librarians, and scholars, I want to just give a little example of something that is actually currently going on this campus involving the library and someone from the College of Arts and Sciences. He is a music faculty member and has created a catalog of the manuscripts of the composer Gustav Mahler. Now, he conceived of it and it currently exists as a Microsoft Word document, an extremely large Microsoft Word document, but it was sort of basic scholarship that he was doing, but he also had in mind that it could exist in an online form that would draw greater attention to it. So he actually is one of the Friedman Fellows this year, and the project is ongoing. So over the course of time, he had a number of conversations with me and then our music librarian on campus, who is the domain expert, the subject domain expert, got involved with it. And between the two of them, and some conversations with our technology team here in the library, they have managed to come up with this very technological term, a data model for what the database should be that this catalog will eventually turn out to be. Now, the realm of expansion of what the catalog may ultimately be, whether it has images of the manuscripts, whether it has links to recorded performances, it could be all sorts of things. But the scholarship was what came first, and so I'm sort of following up on Lev's idea of translational scholarship, that there was an idea, but the faculty member didn't know how to do it, so he enlisted others to help out. But and we are working together, but it still is basically his scholarship.
I think it's a terrific example, and there literally are countless such examples both on this campus and around the nation. I would like to just a small rejoinder to Laura's point about trying to overcome the differentiation between form and function expressed between scholar and service organization. I think this is a profound question. I think this is not a matter of counting how many PhDs are in the department versus a service organization. There are plenty of PhDs in support organizations all over this campus and around the academy. The question is a much more foundational question of identity, identity of scholars and identity of the service and support community, and the received narrative of the hierarchical organizations that we have joined sometime in our professional lives, and we are deliberate and explicit and precise in the use of the language of being a collaborator as opposed to being a co-producer. And that is to appropriately acknowledge the deference and the enormous importance and the privilege of the scholar in the community within which it doesn't mean that we are in some way having a dilutive effect about the way in which collaborators can participate. Our community of technology support on this campus is overwhelmingly filled with PhDs with subject matter expertise, and we see it as enormously professionally gratifying to be engaged in, I don't speak for all of them, perhaps some of them are resenting what I'm about to say, but that in fact is a professionally rewarding role, perhaps very much in line with what a scholar would find enormously rewarding about the output, the product. It's creating visual images, creating database mining models, which have been going on for 30 years in literature, and now are involved in music and soon will be in video. Those are things that faculty typically celebrate as part of their scholarship, and when they acknowledge the new reality as opposed to the historical condition, they would say, it would not have been made possible without collaboration with a great team of service collaborators.
I need to answer that just quickly. I take your point, and I apologize for sounding like I thought it was diluting. What I want to say is that it's not. The new environment is not the same as the publishing environment where the scholar could drop the book off at the door. When I collaborate with people and they start telling me, well, you know, the term translation in the field of medicine means blah, 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 that changes what I'm going to do as a scholar. I object to the distinction between domain experts or content experts and the medium. As a humanist, I am profoundly aware that what is said is inalienably affected by how it is said, and that how involves the medium. And so I don't think I can stick my head in the sand as a humanist. I want to say to somebody who's worried about appropriation by a service department, you're not listening. Oh, good. Okay. I believe in multitasking. Hey, but I want to say that if
This
you
part is the multitasking. Talking and doing this.
that's the professor in me. I'm sorry.
Like West Side Story.
No, but when you talk about appropriation, your work is being appropriated. Look for your book in Google. It's there, and you have no control over it. What you do with your service organization, your local service organization, has no control over it. You can't pick out where somebody's going to land in your book. You can never pick that out. You can never pick out what's going to be copied and downloaded. So what you need to do as a scholar is not run and hide from the technology, but find out about it, learn about it, figure out what kinds of coding you can do behind the scenes that ensure that the context is there, that ensure that your search result comes up first when somebody's looking for that particular poet's mother. All of those technologies are what you need to embrace, not run from.
Peter, you had something.
Thanks. I wanted to return to what I interpreted Lev's challenge to us was, which was to come up with a big project that might bind us together. As a physician, I've been involved in translational work in the version that Lev talked about, and in fact, as a cognitive scientist and a psycholinguist, I'm delighted we translated translation. I mean, it really is an interesting process of coming up with the stories that allow us to understand when we use words that have multiple meanings. I also have lived through the transition, and forgive me if physics is by no means small or dead, but we moved from big physics to big biology. The mapping of the human genome gave biologists an incredible opportunity to kind of band together and say this was our target, and this was what we wanted to accomplish, something that they're obviously continuing to accomplish. The question, though, is can you conceive of something that might be entitled a big humanities project? Is it even worthwhile thinking about? I think there's one thing that makes me think it's worthwhile thinking about. Whether you see the world as economically falling apart from a social justice perspective, or falling apart because of ecological problems, this is a challenge to humanity of an enormous scope that really will require, in my opinion, as a scientist, not as a physicist, mounting a pretty considerable retelling of our story in order to promote our survival. And I personally have been working on narrative medicine and on the visual and other arts, because I think that force for change in the world is something that we need to tap into. So the question is, how can we get the humanities and social scientists to embrace something that might look like that or something else?
You're here.
Peter?
Okay, I have a very practical question. I'm chair of the Department of Religious Studies. We're starting an MA program in the theory and method and theory of religious studies. And I'm sitting here wondering if what you're talking about should be a basic core part of our MA curriculum, and if so, what should it be? What should it look like? What should we be telling our students? And who should do it? I mean, Lev, do you want to come in?
Great question.
I think both of these are actually related comments and questions. And indeed, I think one of the great uses of digital scholarship in the humanities I have found to be is maps. From what was initially just a single layered map to what has become very multi-layered and textured maps. And certainly, whether it's archaeologically related activity, which I know is of interest to to yourself and to the department, whether it is essentially being able to be able to visualize human, religious, community evolution over time across geographies, which is an enormous part of understanding the sociology of religion. Those are enormously enabled by, I think, the use of geospatial information and maps in particular. And so I encourage you to be thinking about a digital humanities underpinning. I don't know that whether that's just because it's interesting 21st century scholarship or perhaps it's about distinctive approach to a master's level program, but to be able to understand the complexities of religion over time. One of the, I mean, only as a student, and I have professed not to have any scholarly insight on this, but as a student who studied comparative religion, in my reflection many years now later is how many different but separate slices of insights I received without actually getting much of the continuity, or much of the flow, and even where the conflicts were. If in fact there was for me as a visual thinker, a mapping infrastructure under it, I think I would have either asked better questions or actually been able to see connections that might not have otherwise been possible. So I think it's pregnant with possibility. That's just one idea, is to use the idea of geospatial and mapping technologies as something that actually allows you to take a database of human religious condition and begin to map it so that it raises questions or raises interesting patterns for us to explore.
Steve?
The Institute of Museum and Library Studies funded 3 or 4 research projects that I think most of them are complete now with final reports, where schools of information science, graduate schools of library and information science, were looking to this issue of broader issues of literacy and competency. So to be a 21st century practitioner in your field, do we go beyond our traditional research methods kind of a mechanism? And so just what I would share with respect to thinking about a specific course or a curriculum, one of the things that emerged from discussions that we had at one of these schools of information science is a distinction in teaching and promoting knowledge of information systems and information architecture as opposed to data vocabularies. They're not the same thing. So there's a macro perspective and a micro perspective, and I think it's difficult to develop a curriculum and find people within our campuses who have the competency to really help us understand how information architecture is structured and what the implications are of system design as distinct from how we format our data and best exploit our data structures to get the kind of results that we want. So I think that there's a couple of different challenges there added on top of something that, as I understand it, still works, which is the research methods approach. I mean, it's kind of going back to Science 101. So that doesn't go away, but in terms of navigating this broader landscape of electronic information, both as producer and consumer, I think as we deepen our understanding and familiarity and broader literacy of that environment, we're more competent. But that there's a couple of different levels of the environment that I'm sure my colleagues here can speak to better than I. But for what it's worth, I just wanted to share that those were some of the tensions that were expressed in thinking about what are some of the core principles to integrate into this kind of a graduate student curriculum. Do we focus on systems and systems architecture, or do we focus on data, and specifically the data that's most familiar to us in our discipline? And it's tough to do both.
Can I just say briefly and concretely that there are many digital humanities certificate programs around the nation, and now a lot of digital humanities PhDs. The religion department shouldn't have to do it on their own. In other words, the class could be populated by people getting MAs in many disciplines across the university.
Cyrus, you want to touch that?
Okay.
Not with a 10 to 12.
No, I mean, just to support. No, my basic point would be to support exactly, that suggestion. In sort of one of the key things that's been brought out is these are fundamentally new methods of research, scholarship, and dissemination that are developing actively now, and they've not yet transformed the traditional fields, but they will certainly have an impact. And so the opportunity to put together a course that would, at a minimum, parameterize people's ignorance so that that they would know what they don't know would, I think, be a big step forward.
Yeah,
I just want to say that just as 20 years ago, when in a graduate history program, I anyway, had to take a course on how to evaluate quantitative history methodology and to be able to analyze a colleague's work and see whether it holds up. You have to have, and the sciences person can totally relate to this, I'm sure, you have to have enough skill in understanding what quantitative methodology is to evaluate whether the work is solid. And so too, in the digital realm, we have to train ourselves to evaluate the work in digital areas and to review it in review literature and say, this work doesn't hold up because this, and this. And we need to have a scholarly communication amongst ourselves about what worked, what didn't, so that we can all, not just to lambaste somebody whose work is no good, but to rather learn from mistakes made, or to be able to say, well, the work changes in how it is translated into a medium. So if it's perceived in a print book, that's one medium. If it's perceived in an online book, that's another medium. They have strengths and weaknesses both ways. So what I'm trying to say is that it's now part of our work as scholars, practitioners, that we have to be critical thinkers in terms of what works, what doesn't. And so what I'm trying to say is, just as if you're a graduate student today and you're not being exposed to how to think critically about digital projects, then you're not going to be an effective scholar. You're not going to be an effective educator.
Thank you.
Can I just give a really short example of digital humanities scholarship in this vein, not about religion, because I don't have an example to give, but around slavery? So there's a very well now established body of scholarship trying to understand and actually raising profound questions about our previously inherited understanding of the slave trade. It started off as a completely scholarly activity, and only in the last 3 years has it actually joined significantly with actually a collaboration with a whole range of professional support to actually do mapping, taking a look at the initial archive material, literally creating databases out of it, and then mapping and creating flows of slave trade around the world, which has raised profound questions about who moved where from where, or who was enslaved from which point to which point. And it turns out South America turns out to be an enormously important embarkation point, which at least in part wasn't as well understood as in the past. Not possible if it had just been the traditional scholarly activity. It was a translational collaboration, which actually is now won book, I'm using it properly, book awards for the scholars for their being able to reach to the public consciousness about revisiting such an important part of the world in human history. So it gives an example of the translational activity that I was referring to earlier. And why not do it for religious studies, the same kind of thing?
We have only a few minutes left, and I want to throw in the final bomb before we finish, which is the reward and incentives for digital scholarship. And what needs to happen for digital scholarship to be recognized in the same way that traditional scholarship is recognized? And do you think we're perhaps already there? Or what more needs to be done if we're not? So anybody want to take that one on?
I think that there is, having done this, I think there are a number of challenges and problems connected to it. One is, rewards, right? Dangerous.
Tenure. Let's put the fine point upon it. Tenure and promotion.
I won't speak to tenure and promotion. That's for my provost to do. But the Dangerous Citizens received, the first award that Dangerous Citizens received was the Prose Awards. And the prose is from American publishers, and it was an award that was awarded to Dangerous Citizens both for its book, its printed edition, and the online edition. So rewards are there. I mean, the book has been reviewed both as an online project, separately from its print version. So rewards are there. But these are, I would say, superficial rewards, because the real rewards come with the accessibility that electronic projects give and make possible. So I might have mentioned this before, I can't remember, but the fact that Dangerous Citizens has actually sold about 1,200 hard copies is one thing, but the fact that it has 13,000 return readers is another thing. And of those 13,000 return readers, a lot come from places such as Iraq and China, 2 from North Korea, Russia, Argentina, Chile, Colombia. I mean, places that I would never have expected people to be buying the print book. So for me, as I think I mentioned before, as a scholar, the accessibility of the material, the accessibility of the book is of far greater importance than the number of books that my publisher is going to sell and the 35 cents that I'm going to make on each one of them. Right, so that's what we make, right? I mean, it's no more than 50. I wait. You get that much? Yeah, right. I have a good publisher. You see, I have a good lawyer. So I think to me that's the reward. There is a problem though, and I want to make this. I know we have to go. I want to underline this. There is a problem which is a pedagogical problem, or it has the potentiality of being a pedagogical problem. With younger generation that is coming into the universities now, who are not only multitasking but have cut their teeth on digital knowledge much more so than on the printed page, the problem is that they will multitask ad infinitum on one hand as they encounter this medium, and that they will not engage as deeply as we would like them to with the material that is, with the content that is available, that is being available to them. So it's that to me, that I mean, the windows and the links are wonderful for people who have already been trained to read actual books. But if we don't train young students into reading electronic books and into alerting them to the problems, the real actual dangers that lay there in front of them, for them in terms of scholarship, then we will go on producing illiterate university students rather than promote literacy. Thank you.
Cyrus?
Yeah, I actually have to leave very briefly, but or very shortly, but let me briefly comment on your specific question about the promotion and tenure process. This is a complicated issue, and much of what's been discussed here in terms of change of the culture, change of what's considered scholarship impacts it directly. And let me take as sort of an example the process within the College of Arts and Sciences here, and where we actually have in process at the moment something that I hope will lead to a reconsideration at the departmental level of digital scholarship in the promotion and tenure process. For practical matter, the promotion and tenure process is controlled by the faculty. They define what the criteria are for promotion and tenure. It's done at a general level at the college and university level, and it's done at a specific level at the departmental level. So when you have departments, as we do, that say that to be promoted you have to have a book, a physical object, then young faculty in those departments will shy away from digital projects until after they have tenure because of concerns about, legitimate concerns given what the text says about being eligible for promotion and tenure. So to really change it, you've got to change the perceptions of the faculty within the departments as to what constitutes digital scholarship and an appreciation of it, and they in turn have to revisit the promotion and tenure guidelines and change what's written down. That's not actually sufficient because you can have a very progressive department where this is the case, but a key part of the process is getting external evaluations from eminent scholars around the world, and where the goal is imminent. If the field is such that there isn't a broad recognition of the importance of digital scholarship, then those letters are going to be poor, and the department, the chair, and the dean may argue very strongly that you should discount this prize-winning. The letter from this prize-winning referee at an eminent institution, but it will cause problems. And we have many disciplines, including in particular in the humanities, that have still not, as disciplines, managed to evolve away from sort of 19th century approaches to what constitutes scholarship. It is changing. It's changing within the college, not nearly as fast as I would like it to see, but probably about as fast as we can reasonably hope. I'm confident it will work out. I should say that there's another thing I wanted to briefly raise, and then I unfortunately have to leave. I started off by saying it's grounded at the departmental level. One of the issues that we talked about earlier was the importance of interdisciplinary scholarship. So, this still gets, is fraught for opportunity of getting chewed up within the existing promotion and tenure processes in most places, because just as there's not yet well-defined ways of recognizing, say, digital scholarship in many disciplines, it's not always the case that interdisciplinary scholarship gets properly rewarded in terms of the long-time impact. And again, there I actually, I'm not as optimistic about significant short-term change as I am with digital scholarship.
All right. Thank you, Cyrus. And with that, we'll make that the last comment of this morning, now afternoon. And I want to thank all of the panelists, and I want to thank you all for contributing to making this a successful colloquium. And I know some of you will be continuing with us as part of the faculty discussions that are going to be occurring next. So thank you again.